Well, that was quite possibly one of the most perfect starts to any Formula 1 season possible. But for completely the different reasons that we all expected. And the most important reason why? Lando Norris didn't bottle it. If you want to understand what I mean, last year, something changed within Lando since the title slipped through his fingers after Brazil. And this weekend showed that in spades. Because throughout the entire race, Lando was not only quite competent, stable, and serene despite the conditions throwing everything possible in his direction and everyone else, he was also quite confident over the radio, something that we didn't really see much of in 2024, when he would basically just go with whatever the pit wall said. Norris was confident enough to be able to push back, all amidst a Max Verstappen who was overdriving that car quite considerably, to the point where at the end of the race, he was within 1 second of Norris and could almost take the thing should the McLaren have made a mistake. Well, that didn't happen. This was something to be proud of this race, probably even more so than all of the 20-second romps that he had over the course of last year. And even though his teammate was ramping up the pressure himself, Norris still kept it together and wasn't ordering anything over the radio to try and fend off Oscar. And I'm very pleased with what Lando's been able to do here, especially right off the back of the news that not only did Oscar Piastri himself get a contract extension, but now both drivers are on equal pay. I could have easily expected Lando to really stumble with that news, but no, he didn't. He came out as the stronger of the two, he won on the race day, and he also did it in the rain where Max Verstappen thrives no matter what car he's in. And he's been able to do something that nobody since Charles Leclerc has been able to do, and that is to lead the championship standings for the first time in over 1,000 days. Max Verstappen has been in charge since the middle of 2022. Now, it's somebody else. What a great start to the year. And I am really pleased that all of the stuff McLaren has done, what Norris has done, what everyone has done, has produced a result that is still fascinating and interesting, despite everyone thinking McLaren would have had a 1-2 finish in front of everyone else by about maybe 20-25 seconds. All I've got to say is, Lando, well done. That was great. And the same has to go for Max Verstappen. Despite the RB21 having an incredibly small operating window still, Max did what he needed to do, and what he has done for several years, and showed his prowess in the wet, which according to Ayrton Senna, is one of the great levelers of any Formula 1 driver, no matter what car you're in. It showed that even though Red Bull technically may have the third or fourth fastest car, in the hands of Max Verstappen, that figure does not matter, akin to what we saw with Fernando Alonso in the Ferrari of 2012. Fernando, in that Ferrari that year, and I suspect this is something that we may see from the likes of Max Verstappen in the Red Bull of this year. And what I find extremely pleasing is that he's also easing off in terms of the pressure and aggression that he's putting on the team. Sure, he's not allowing the team to just rest on their laurels or take it easy, he's just choosing to apply his pressure a little more differently, a bit more constructively. He actually enjoyed himself out there, that he had fun. This is a more light-hearted Verstappen than what we saw in the middle of last year. Something has changed within him as well. He's still the absolute all-guns-blazing driver on the track, but off the track, he seems to be just chilled, relaxed, calm, and having a really good battle with Lando Norris right at the end was probably a pleasant change of pace of what he was expecting on Friday, something that we've seen far too often with the likes of Red Bull, where they're struggling to find pace. Despite qualifying being 4 tenths behind the likes of Piastri and Norris, he was able to make up the difference, and this is a true winning performance as well, which reminds you of how good Verstappen is. It was just a good, clean fight between Lando and Max. Now they actually have sussed each other out. They were able to do that without making contact or anything like that, or getting all aggressive on the radio. Brilliant! That's really good for us. Even though that could change over the course of a season, if a championship campaign is mounted between them and maybe Charles Leclerc or somebody else. And how could I not mention Mercedes? Well, looks like my Mercedes Verstappen video from the other day doesn't seem so silly now, does it? Not only did I correctly predict that George Russell will be able to make the most of the conditions and get on the third step of the podium, but also Kimi Antonelli, my goodness. That was an absolute barnstormer of a drive, and it really makes you wonder what he might have been able to do had he qualified in the top 10. Hey, at the very least, Toto's probably very, very pleased that he was the one to put Kimi in the car. And even though it looked a little bit shaky that the team got a 5-second time penalty for an unsafe release with the Sauber, upon a right to review, that got overturned, and Kimi got to keep his 12 points, which means that Mercedes and McLaren are fronting the constructors, and I'm pretty sure Toto will be really pleased about that 2 Mercedes-powered teams are fronting the team championship. But in any case, the W16 is off to the best of starts possible for them, with two drivers really going at it and showing their competitive streak against all of their other rivals. And what's really fascinating and quite pleasing in terms of the competitive edge amongst multiple drivers is that according to Russell, the car was not at its strongest, that there might still be a little bit more left in the tank. And again, if Kimi was in the proper position of what we might have expected, because according to many, that bib damage that he had cost him at least 3/10 on that lap, is really exciting now. And suddenly people are turning to Kimi and going, oh, I understand all of the stuff you were able to do at Silverstone and F2, that feature race in the rain, where he won it quite dominantly. Maybe he can translate it here. Maybe Prema was the fault after all as to why his F2 season wasn't all that great when compared to Formula Regional. Yes, I know, there are loads of talking points to be had for the future, and this is only race one regarding Kimi. I believe, as some might have pointed out to me, this is the strongest rookie performance that we've seen since K-Mag in 2014 from McLaren. But either way, thanks to their rookie starlet, Mercedes have had the best start to a season since 2021. And speaking of best starts, Alex Albon. It's a shame that he missed out on getting 4th place after the penalty for Antonelli got overturned, but still, a top 5 finish for Williams, that is really a good sign that all of the hype and smoke that had been blowing up your backsides has some truth to it after all. And I'm more than happy to give Alex credit where credit is due. Because I know some of you may come at me in the comments for talking up Sainz more than Albon in recent months, and that is somewhat valid. I wasn't entirely sure how Alex would respond to the arrival of Carlos, but I'm pleased to see that the Thai racer hasn't buckled at all, far from it. Because as he said in various interviews, he's risen to the occasion. He's got a fresh perspective about what he can offer the team. And it's paid off in dividends because now Williams, it's clear, they've got two strong drivers. And if Carlos can make it through and understand the softer tyres a little bit more, both Sainz and Albon could be really interesting double points finishers, especially if some of the top 4 teams have a problematic sort of a day. And maybe if the other midfield contenders can't really compete, because you've only got to look at what happened with Alpine. They completely crumbled. One of them crashed out very early on. Gasly was nowhere. Sauber suddenly paid a little cheeky visit. Haas nowhere to be seen. And Racing Bulls, well, I mean, their drivers are pretty impressive, but their strategy department has something else entirely to say about that. Williams look the most stable now, in all respects. Well, I mean, except the gearbox, maybe, which caused that sudden torque surge that Carlos was talking about. That may have actually taken out some other drivers as well, especially the rookies, who wouldn't have really understood the comprehension of that happening with an upshift in an F1 car. It was something that took everyone by surprise. But either way, Carlos, it happened to him. Alex, it didn't, so that's something to mention. But in any case, this is only the first race, and Williams are already in double figures, and this was purely on merit, because qualifying, they both did it in Q3 in the dry. And the sight of Alex holding back Hamilton for all of those laps not only reassured me that the spirit of Giga Kubica lives on at Grove still, but it also took me back to the early 2000s. 2003 most notably, the last time where Williams and Ferrari were really compellingly competitive with one another. You could easily argue that 2014 was like that as well, but 2003, that was more exciting, honestly, because that was going for the Constructors' Championship as well. And according to Vowles, even when Carlos binned it, he didn't go slinking off to his room and sulk there. He got back on the radio and helped his teammate out with advice on the inters, which is exactly what he wanted to do. And I'm not cheapening Alex's effort by saying this at all, not one bit, because he was the one on the road, in those conditions, and he didn't bin it like Carlos did. But the sense of unity here is so authentic, it's genuine. They want to help each other out, and I would hope that Alex would return the favour if the roles were reversed, that they simply want Williams to be back where they're supposed to be. And this is probably one of the most genuine examples you could see of that, because you can hear words and words and words and words, but actions speak louder than words, and if Vowles, what he said was true, then that was probably the biggest endorsement that he could possibly give any of his drivers, not just on what they do on the track. I'm now really thinking that maybe 5th place is something that they might get after all without having to hold anything back, because we'll get onto Alpine in a moment, because they've got a lot of problems at the moment, and the situation with Flavio, it might make even Gunther Steiner blush, saying, "Oh, Jesus Christ, Flavio, calm down." And okay, you probably don't want me to talk about Lance, but you do need to give credit where it's due if you're doing a winners and losers video. And Lance was a winner here, because he kept it clean in conditions where he has shown potential in the past. He delivered, especially when you look to his teammate, who binned the car in the same circumstances. That is something we do need to say, that when Lance has a good day, then You talk about it. 6th place, it mirrored the start he had in 2023 when Aston Martin were the second fastest team. It's a really impressive shout, and therefore he was able to give points to Aston Martin where they probably weren't expecting to get any considering how strong Williams and Alpine were in testing. 8 points on the first bounce? Not terrible, not bad at all. And Adrian Newey's not touching that car, supposedly. So this is Lance doing it, and if he can actually step up, then fair play to him. But it's going to be a very tall order to try and convince the wider world that Stroll has finally arrived and he has stepped up to the plate. But for the first race, not bad, especially considering, again, Alonso binned it. But whilst Aston Martin should be satisfied with their lot, Sauber should be jubilant, because you've got to look at what Hülkenberg has done in the first race. Through Nico's efforts alone, they have amassed 150% of the points they got throughout the entirety of 2024. And according to his post-race interview, Nico certainly didn't expect that at all. It was a surprise, considering that according to the first half of the race, they weren't expecting anything like that. But I think there has been a change within that team since Mattia Binotto has arrived, which has really improved their circumstances for a cheeky point or two later on in the season. Because a regular comment that we saw all through 2024 is that, yeah, sure, they might have had a solid start to the race, but by the second half of the race, they were nowhere. They would fall off the back of the grid and they would be plumb last. They were still there where it mattered. At the end of the race, they didn't lose pace and they didn't fall to the back of the grid. I mean, Haas were doing that this time around. He's already justified his move, and considering what Haas have been doing with their strategies and adjusting their VF25, maybe it was the right call to go over to Audi after all. I mean, he must be really, really relieved he picked the right moment to leave. He did his part for that team, now he's doing his part with this one. And it's still a really rare sight to see a Sauber in the winners section. But now he must move on to the meh. And you might be thinking I'm biased here, but Piastri does manage to raise himself out of the losers section and into the meh. Because as the likes of Kurun Chandok pointed out fairly, bar one corner on one lap, Piastri was matching Lando in terms of performance, which is great for us as viewers in regards to entertainment for the year. But then you just got the awkward radio delays, and admittedly I did jump the gun a little bit on social media, calling out the thing about holding position, because I am extremely sensitive to any team orders going down at Woking, especially considering the papaya rules thing. But I have looked back on it, I've retracted some of the statements that I made, but either way, it's still just a moment where I'm on edge. I mean, the spanner of speculation, I'm holding it a little bit. Turn this down all the way to its minimum setting. I really hope it's not the case, but there's a tiny little bit of speculation in my mind about what's going on at Woking. I really hope that's not the case. Within a 1/10 of a second in qualifying, he didn't fall off the back of Norris. He kept really within DRS after he got past Verstappen, which in itself is a really positive thing since Piastri really struggled in dirty air. Yes, it doesn't help that he's 23 points behind Lando Norris at this point after the first race. Even though Oscar beached the car, he still managed to keep the engine running. He actually got out of the grass, which is something we didn't think could ever happen at that corner, and then he managed to get back into the points and then pull a blinder of an overtake over Lewis Hamilton into a section of the track where it's one of the most fastest areas where you never think you could do the overtake on the outside. That is a really ballsy move. All I can say, it's going to be a blinder if McLaren are the only ones out there, and if Oscar and Lando are really free to race. Really. And then considering that this was his debut race for Sauber and what was believed to be the slowest car on the grid to boot, Gabriel Bortoleto flew and did not disgrace himself at all. He certainly paid to bed all the stuff that Helmut Marko said about him being a B-grade driver. He conducted himself really well, Gabriel. How mature he was, how level-headed, how professional. Even though he wasn't able to convert it to a classified finish, I still think that this race was a really decent shout for getting that car out of Q1 where Hülkenberg failed. And whilst other rookies were struggling and going off, even some of the veterans dealing with that same fate, Bortoleto held his own. But then a sudden suspension failure put paid to his efforts, and nobody's entirely sure how that came about. Seriously, I've been trying to look all over social media and asking people for like, hey, what happened? And no one's entirely certain as to why. Was it a loose train cover that took out his rear suspension and caused him to spin and retire? Was there some sort of general fault with that part of the car? Because we did see the Sauber have lots of failures over the course of 2024, Zhou in particular. Or maybe was it something to do with maybe some banging of wheels with Liam Lawson? That might come to light in the fullness of time, but either way, it was a mechanical failure of some description which put paid to Gabriel's efforts, because he might have finished the race alongside Behrman and Antonelli, and in of itself, in that car, which is not the class act of the field, that is a respectable shout, as it were. And it also means, thanks to the plights of racing bulls and whatnot, he's not classified last in the championship standings. That is a plus of itself. And yes, I may as well not surprise any of you out there, but I'm putting Carlos Sainz in the miss section, just about lifting him out of the losers section. I will openly hold my hand up and say, yes, Carlos did have his struggles with the car, especially the C5 tyre. He openly said that he had yet to fully understand that tyre, and I wouldn't blame him, because in pre-season testing, not one team ran a meaningful run on those C5 tyres. Everyone was having to guess exactly what they could do. But what Carlos was able to prove somewhat in Q1 and Q2, and Alex throughout the entirety of qualifying, is that, yeah, the Williams is okay on the C5, they just need a little bit more data, but then there'll be other tracks where the C4 is a soft tyre. He did have a mistake, whereas Alex didn't. But still, the impact of Carlos being there, instead of it being Alex and a rookie, it's already paid dividends, especially contributing to Alex's own efforts. This is probably what Toto's been trying to say to everybody. Every dream needs a team. And Carlos and Alex, they are a good team. Because again, he stayed on the pit wall. He offered his own findings and suggestions saying, oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And it worked. It all worked out. It paid off. And that's what I mean. If he wasn't a team player and he just kept his helmet on and he just had a paddy or a tantrum or something like that and went into his motorhome to just cry in solitude, I wouldn't be putting him in this section, I'd be putting him in the losers section. But no, he rose above it. Williams have now actually had a good result out of it, and it's something that they can get one over the likes of Alpine and Haas considerably, even racing bulls. So this is just fantastic for the team. It's just enough to make me to go, okay, Carlos, I would rather you not crash the car next time out and have a proper double points finish like we all thought would be the case on Saturday, but I still stand by it. They have been able to irritate the constructors, but not the one I expected, because starting off the loser section is the one that irritated the most, Ferrari. Oh my goodness. Even with the supposed gamble of setting up their car for the wet conditions instead of the dry on Saturday, that Ferrari car was not able to exacerbate the situation as much as they would have hoped, closing in on McLaren and Verstappen. In fact, you could easily say the car looked surprisingly and distinctly average. Sure, Charles Leclerc was able to do something more with it, albeit slightly, and then have a gaff on the radio that is almost akin to George Russell going, "No, there's rain on the visor," and then being pointed out it was sweat, and then Charles going, "Oh, there is rain in the cockpit." Yeah, because it's wet out there. It's just like, does that Charles radio quip outdo George's or something like that? But either way, the results are far from a laughing matter, let's just say that, especially all the hype that everyone was looking into from preseason testing, my own predictions. My goodness, this was not a good weekend for them at all. And with Lewis Hamilton struggling far more than Leclerc and the team expected, that was a major red flag. And this isn't me slating him, so you know. Lewis has admitted that there was a lot to get on top of in such a short space of time, and also in the face of the realization that the car wasn't in the best position for both he and his teammates. But I must talk about what was said over the radio at the end of the race, and even during the race. And I will put a qualifier here and say that Riccardo Adami, his race engineer, and Lewis, they've still got to really find their feet with one another. Kind of like what we saw with Bottas. His race engineer got changed without warning, and that really didn't help his Miami campaign at all. He almost crashed into Piastri in that event. The same applies with Lewis, but you got to admit, Riccardo Adami and he probably would have been having a chat since before his arrival at Ferrari. They could at least just get to know each other personally, but there's still some work to be done in terms of procedure in a race environment. Because what's really clear, along with Charles, is that both Ferrari drivers do not want information overload. And that is something that Ricciardo has to work on. And Lewis also has to realise that they're only trying to help, they're not trying to annoy you. You could tell a really obvious situation where Lewis was trying to keep his cool and not shout over the radio in the very first race he has with the Scuderia. And then the relative silence afterwards for him finishing in 10th, which is something that I don't think Ferrari or he would have wanted, especially since Leclerc wasn't that much better. That was a really awkward situation. I really hope it changes with time and that they can actually bounce back from this and then they find their form with some upgrades coming along. But when McLaren are doing all of this and Piastri didn't score as much simply for the fact that the rain caught him out, and then Mercedes are right there as well. Ooh, oh, okay. maybe that huge gamble of changing the car entirely might not have been worth it, or at least they got to really dial it in quickly. And I really, really hope that the fandoms of Hamilton and Leclerc just cool it, that they keep themselves calm and collected. They don't shout at Ferrari for any reason, because that's exactly what they don't need right now. So behave. Lewis hopefully will improve from this, and Charles will improve from this as well. But needless to say, I'm pretty sure there is a major alarm going off in Maranello. And there might be alarm bells going on Liam Lawson's side of the garage, someone else who doesn't need all of this pressure right now. Even though Racing Bulls and Yuki Tsunoda fell flat from their lofty positions in qualifying and failed to score any points, Liam failed to finish, well, at all. He became yet another one of those rookies who got caught out by the weather. But the difference here is that Liam Lawson has at least had half a season, and the irony of this all is that he arrived in Formula 1 at Zandvoort when it was pelting it down, and he finished the race there. So it isn't maybe something to do with purely a skill issue. It may be just yet another indicator that the second Red Bull driver has some sort of issue going on with it. And I seriously think that Checo was onto something. There was something going on. This is helping justify that situation. This entire weekend was nothing short of tragic, because I recall the commentators pointing out that the time difference between Liam and Max in those conditions, when it was damp on those inters as they were going off, got to up to 3 seconds. 3! Something's wrong there. Something needs to be looked at from either the driver's point of view or the car's. And then a spin ended his chance to respond, or at least get the car home. And reportedly there were no issues with the car itself over the weekend, according to he, nor was he just changing out parts for the 2024 spec. It's just that over the course of the weekend, he was just being honest and said that it was simply down to him not being fast enough. I mean, I appreciate the honesty and that he wasn't coming up with excuses that weren't his fault, but given how much scrutiny there is aimed at Red Bull's direction, that's probably not the smartest thing to say, that people won't look to you and go, oh, he's actually being quite pragmatic and realistic. No, they're just going to say, we knew it, he's a fraud, which is unfair, but I can't stop it. It's going to happen no matter what I say. Simply because there are so many fandoms and countries out there that want Liam's head on a spike. But the world will be looking to Red Bull as to what they do next. One thing is for sure. With Mercedes having a competent car and their rookie being on it from the get-go in the same circumstances, it's quite alarming. And I gotta be real here, I've never seen such a huge change of perception in a driver such as with Lawson. Only 18 months ago, he was being lauded as the future of Formula 1. Now people want him back out again. And I will admit here is that the aura between he and Max as teammates, it does feel very off. I think I saw a clip where he was rocking up some sunglasses and Max was like, oh, I'm not really one to comment. Oh, yeah, they look good under pressure. But then when Ricciardo was doing the same thing in a video, Max and he were having proper banter. I know that they've only just started off as teammates, but yeah, there's something off here. It's weird. And I really hope that Liam and he can actually get to know one another better and that Liam can actually integrate himself more, because this was not the best of starts. Especially considering that the same track last year, Checo at least still scored. And then there's Haas. Oh dear. This was a huge fall from grace, but it all seems to come from a really weird position, an issue from testing. Simply because I believe that they spent most of their time, in fact all of their time during pre-season testing, focusing on race programs, race runs, not having any time at all dedicated to giving Esteban Ocon and Oliver Behrman any time where they were allowed to push the car and go flat out for a qualifying run. Only at this race weekend were they allowed to do so. And therefore, what can they do when it's all changeable conditions? They have the race data, sure, but what good is that if they don't have any wet weather race data to work it up with? And Iokamatsu admits this from an engineering point of view. There is work to be done. They now know what they need to do to get the car better. But this wasn't the best of starts at all. It made Haas out to be just going back to type that maybe 2024 was a false dawn. And that is not good. I hope they turn things around. And I'm really glad that Ocon's been relatively forgiving. He's been very patient, very measured. I expected him to fly off the handle, but he didn't. And then Oliver Behrman, I mean, oh my goodness, he's not really doing the narrative he set out last year any favours, is he? Every single practice session, he had some sort of an issue which compromised his run, and then he qualifies right at the back of the grid. And then, yeah, sure, he finished the race, but he was still last. Which is something that couldn't be said for Alpine, and I don't think Flavio was hoping for this, was he? Sure, Pierre got the car into Q3, which wasn't too bad, but the sight of Jack Doohan succumbing to the conditions, like others, not just him, and then Gasly falling out of the points after clinging on to 10th for dear life, to a Williams, and then an Aston Martin, and then even a Sauber, I would not be surprised if Pierre and Jack are taken to Flavio's office after the race and then given an utter rollicking. And sure, the car isn't a terrible one. The rain did throw some variables into play which would have compromised their campaign as well as others, but this is a stark contrast to what the team was capable of doing in similar conditions just a few months ago in Brazil. A double podium? Well, no points at all here. And put simply, it just seemed like the drivers weren't able to make the most of these conditions to try and get some cheeky points away from some of the more established teams, including some of their rivals. Haas way down below, one of their closest rivals last year, they scored the same amount of points as them. 0. And I do feel bad for Jack. He got caught out like others, included more experienced drivers. But in the world of Briatore, that simply doesn't matter. But apparently all the reserve drivers are in contention for that seat. And now Pierre not able to convert, who knows how long he'll be safe for as well. I mean, I don't want to think about it, but with Briatore, I got no idea now. Especially him making that quip to Pierre's face in Drive to Survive, thinking he was one of those Venkos. It's like, woof. And as for Racing Bulls, oh, that was tragic. The car itself was incredibly competitive, and it was looking likely that Yuki Tsunoda was going to bring home an important clutch of points. In fact, just before his pit stop, he was in 4th place. He could have matched his best ever finishing result in Abu Dhabi 2021, which is a fact that probably not many people remember because for, well, other reasons. Unfortunately, the issues that befell him and Daniel Ricciardo and Liam Lawson last year reared their ugly heads once again, and the strategy put paid to that was the fact that they stayed out on slick tyres longer than they should have, and by the time they came out, they were out of the points because everyone basically undercut them. And then, of course, Isaac Hadjar. I feel for this kid because I will admit, last year in free practice sessions, I was not impressed by him, but now I am. I saw him do well in free practice, testing he didn't embarrass himself, and he qualified in 11th, almost got into Q3 in that car. Not bad at all. But then he goes and spins out before the race even starts. I don't want to be the one to say it, but objectively it's true. Isaac didn't make the start. It was a complete disaster. But one thing I was really pleased to see is that Anthony Hamilton took Isaac under his wing and gave him a big bear hug with encouragement. That's really nice to see, considering how much Isaac idolizes the like of Lewis Hamilton. To have his dad come in and console him in that moment when he's feeling at his lowest, that was really powerful, and I'm really pleased that he had that support. And as for Yuki Tsunoda, I mean, he was at one point looking ready to take points away from Red Bull Racing and really assert himself for the future. And even though I think Mario Andretti is still purchasing a Duolingo subscription to quickly learn some Japanese to try and maybe hire him, the fact is, though, is that what we saw on Saturday didn't convert, but it wasn't the fault of the driver. At this point, you could be right behind your sister team in the constructors, but you played it badly. You've really got to learn from this. And speaking of learning, I think you need to learn a little bit more as to exactly what Toto has in mind for both of his drivers, now that he said Max Verstappen is no longer on his radar. To find out why I feel pretty good about my judgment call, and I think Mercedes is not a place for the Dutchman anymore, and that Kimi and George are the future, and they will get their contract soon, watch this video next, straight after this one.